The emergency room at St. Vincent Hospital buzzed with the kind of organized chaos only seasoned professionals could navigate. Valerie Ellis moved through it like a force of nature, focused, steady, and determined. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, a few strands escaping to frame her sharp, intelligent face. She was a woman of clean lines and efficiency, her white coat pristine despite the constant whirlwind of activity. At 33, Valerie had built a life defined by precision and control. She thrived in the intensity of her job, but her personal life was barren, a landscape devoid of connection or vulnerability. It wasn't something she dwelled on. Until that night. The double doors swung open and a rush of cold air burst into the ear as a group of people stormed in. At the center was a young woman with blood streaking her temple, clutching her arm as two friends supported her weight. Valerie was already stepping forward to intervene when she saw her. Elena Harper. She strode in alongside them, her presence impossible to ignore. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads, wavy dark brown hair cascading over her shoulders, a tailored coat framing her lean figure and sharp hazel eyes that burned with intensity. Her expression was both fierce and protective, her words clear and commanding as she spoke to a nurse. She was injured at a protest, Elena explained, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. She was knocked down and trampled. She needs immediate care. Valerie stepped in then, assessing the situation with practiced calm. I've got it from here, she said, her tone professional but firm. She turned to the young woman. Can you tell me where it hurts? I can't move my arm, the girl whimpered, her face pale. Valerie nodded, her focus sharp. You'll be okay. Let's get you to an exam room. As the young woman was wheeled away, Valerie turned back to find Elena watching her. Their eyes met and something electric flickered in the space between them. Valerie felt her heart stutter, a rare and unsettling occurrence. Elena tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. You're good at this, she said, her voice lighter now. Calm under pressure. It's my job, Valerie replied evenly, though she found herself holding Elena's gaze longer than necessary. You're the one who brought her in? Elena nodded. I'm her lawyer. She's one of many activists I work with. Things got out of hand tonight. Valerie's brow furrowed slightly. Protesting. Marching, Elena corrected gently. For housing rights. Someone got aggressive. People got hurt. Valerie studied her for a moment. The fire in her voice, the certainty in her posture. Elena was unlike anyone Valerie had encountered in years. Where Valerie was controlled and clinical, Elena seemed fueled by passion and boldness, like she could set the entire room on fire with her words alone. Thanks for looking after her, Elena added, her tone softer now. I'm guessing you don't get thanked often. Valerie's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Not really, no. The moment lingered, the hum of the ER fading into the background. I'm Elena Harper, by the way, she said, offering her hand. Dr. Valerie Ellis, Valerie replied, shaking it. Elena's grip was firm, her touch warmer than Valerie expected. Elena's smile widened slightly. I'll let you get back to saving the world, Dr. Ellis. But I owe you one. And with that she was gone, her coat swirling around her as she disappeared through the doors. Valerie found herself staring after her, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Who is this woman? Over the next few days, Valerie couldn't stop thinking about Elena Harper. It was absurd. She'd spent years building walls to keep distractions out, to focus solely on her patients and the demands of her job. And yet Elena had somehow slipped past those defenses in a matter of minutes. Their paths crossed again a week later, when Elena returned to check on the injured activist. She found Valerie in the hospital hallway reviewing charts, and approached with that same effortless confidence. Dr. Ellis, Elena greeted with a smile. Busy as ever? Valerie looked up, startled but composed. Always. Good to know some things don't change. Valerie quirked an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. What brings you back? I promised to follow up with my client, Elena replied, leaning casually against the wall. And I hoped I might run into you again. Valerie froze for half a second, her heart skipping a beat before she masked it with her usual calm. Is that so? It is. Elena's smile turned teasing, her eyes glinting with mischief. How about dinner, Dr. Ellis? Or does saving lives leave no room for eating? Valerie opened her mouth to respond but faltered. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her out, let alone someone like Elena. Bold. Fearless. I don't usually take time for yourself? Elena finished for her. I gathered that much. She pushed off the wall, her gaze steady. Think about it. I'm not going anywhere. And she didn't. Their first date wasn't really a date at all. It was supposed to be a quick dinner to discuss the activist's case. Valerie told herself it was professional, a conversation over plates of pasta at a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet Chicago street. But the evening stretched on, laughter replacing formalities, barriers falling with each shared story. Elena was captivating. She talked about her work, fighting for those without voices, challenging systems that seemed unmovable. Valerie found herself drawn in, asking questions she normally wouldn't ask, wanting to understand the fire that fueled this woman. And in return, Elena seemed fascinated by Valerie's calm, her practicality, the way she balanced strength and gentleness. You care about your patients, Elena said, studying Valerie over her glass of wine. It's not just a job to you. I can tell. Valerie looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. It's hard not to care. It's what makes you special, Elena replied softly. That night, when Elena leaned in and kissed her outside the restaurant, Valerie didn't pull away. She let herself get lost in the moment. The warmth of Elena's touch, the softness of her lips, the thrill that coursed through her. From that night on, there was no turning back. The weeks that followed were like something out of a dream. Valerie and Elena fell into each other's lives with startling ease. Elena's energy balanced Valerie's seriousness, her laughter filling spaces in Valerie's world that she hadn't realized were empty. They spent late nights on Elena's apartment balcony, glasses of wine in hand as the Chicago skyline twinkled around them. Valerie opened up in ways she hadn't in years, and Elena listened, really listened, like no one else ever had. But just as Valerie began to let her guard down, the messages started. The first one was vague, an anonymous text that arrived late one night while Valerie was at work. Be careful with Elena Harper. Valerie stared at the screen, frowning. She ignored it, brushing it off as a mistake or a prank. But then came the second message and the third. You don't know who she really is. Ask her about her past before it's too late. Valerie didn't want to believe it. Elena was kind, loyal, passionate. But the messages kept coming, their words burrowing into Valerie's mind like poison. The details were too specific. References to her shifts at the hospital, to her nights spent with Elena. When she finally confronted Elena about it one evening, Elena laughed it off, though there was something tight in her smile. Val, it's probably someone I pissed off at work, Elena said lightly. People hold grudges. It's nothing. But Valerie wasn't so sure. And as the days wore on, the perfect world she'd begun to build with Elena started to feel less secure. Because whoever was sending those messages wasn't going to stop. And whoever they were, they knew far too much. The evening was cool, a biting Chicago wind slicing through the streets as Valerie exited the hospital. It was the kind of night where the city felt both alive and lonely, the hum of traffic mixing with the distant wail of sirens. Valerie tugged her coat tighter around herself as she made her way across the parking lot, her breath clouding in the cold air. She'd had another grueling shift, 3 trauma cases, an endless stream of patients, and all she wanted was to get home, sink into the couch, and maybe convince Elena to share a glass of wine and one of her stories about courtroom battles that always made Valerie smile. Elena had a way of filling even the darkest rooms with light, and tonight Valerie felt like she needed that light more than ever. Valerie slid into her car and started the engine, letting the hum of the heater warm her numb fingers. The hospital lot was nearly empty, just a handful of cars scattered in the dim orange glow of the overhead lights. She rubbed at her eyes, fatigue settling in her bones. As she pulled out onto the main road, the city loomed around her. Skyscrapers cutting jagged edges against the night sky, their windows glowing like constellations. It wasn't until she hit the first stoplight that the unease crept in. A black car, sleek, nondescript, had turned onto the road behind her. At first, Valerie didn't think anything of it. This was Chicago, sharing the streets was inevitable. But as she wound her way through the neighborhood streets, taking her usual shortcuts, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car was still there. Her grip tightened on the wheel as she glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. The black car stayed at a steady distance, close enough to follow, far enough to avoid suspicion. Calm down, she told herself. You're overreacting. But she wasn't. Her stomach twisted as she turned left, then right, and the car mirrored every move. A prickle of fear climbed up her spine, and her heart began to beat faster, drowning out the faint hum of the radio. She slowed her speed, hoping the car would pass her, but it didn't. The headlights stayed fixed in her rearview mirror like a pair of eyes watching her every move. Okay, she muttered under her breath, her voice a thin thread of tension. Instinct kicked in. Valerie turned down a random side street, weaving through residential neighborhoods, taking sharp turns, doubling back on her own route. The tires squealed faintly as she pushed the car a little harder, her pulse roaring in her ears. She glanced at the mirror again. There it was. The same black car. Damn it, she breathed, gripping the wheel. She didn't stop until she was certain the car was gone. After circling the same few blocks multiple times, the black sedan had finally disappeared, leaving Valerie shaken but relieved. She pulled into her apartment building's garage, her hands trembling as she killed the engine. For a long moment she sat there, her breathing uneven, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. Just coincidence, a paranoid misreading of the situation. But the gnawing feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. The elevator ride to her apartment felt interminable. When Valerie finally opened the door to the place she shared with Elena, the familiar warmth of their home hit her like a blanket. Elena was there waiting, standing by the kitchen counter with an open bottle of wine and 2 glasses. A small, knowing smile curved her lips, the kind that always made Valerie's pulse skip. Rough night. Elena teased gently, pouring a glass and handing it to Valerie. For a moment the sight of her, the easy confidence, the soft waves of dark hair framing her face, was enough to calm Valerie. She took the glass gratefully, setting her bag by the door and exhaling a shaky breath. Something happened, she said finally, her voice low. Elena's smile faltered slightly, concern flickering across her features. What do you mean? Valerie hesitated, trying to find the words. I think someone followed me home tonight. A black car. It was tailing me for miles. Elena set her glass down, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper. Something almost guarded. Are you sure? It's probably just a coincidence. No, Valerie shook her head firmly. It wasn't. I know what I saw, Elena. It followed me through every turn. For a brief second, Valerie thought she saw something flicker in Elena's eyes. Something like panic, but it was gone before she could place it. Elena stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Valerie's arm. Val, listen to me, she said softly. You're exhausted. You've been working nonstop. Sometimes we see things that aren't really there. Valerie pulled back, her brow furrowing. That's not what this is. Someone was following me. I felt it. Elena's expression tightened just slightly. You need to trust me, okay? I'll handle this. How? Valerie demanded, her voice rising. What does that even mean? Elena hesitated, then looked away, her jaw clenched as if she were holding something back. It's probably just someone from work, she said finally. I've made enemies before. People lose cases and hold grudges. It wouldn't be the first time. Valerie stared at her, searching her face for answers that didn't come. Something about Elena's tone, the dismissiveness in her words, didn't sit right. Elena, if there's something you're not telling me. There's nothing, Elena interrupted, her voice firm. I promise you, Val. It's nothing to worry about. Valerie wanted to believe her. She wanted to trust Elena. To believe that this was just a misunderstanding, some random coincidence. But as she sat across from Elena on the couch later that night, her glass of wine untouched, she couldn't ignore the doubt clawing at her chest. Elena was hiding something. The next morning, Valerie arrived at work feeling unrest, her mind clouded with suspicion and exhaustion. She forced herself to focus on her rounds, on her patients, but the unease never left her. By the time she reached her locker to grab a fresh set of scrubs, she felt like a wound pulled too tight. Then she saw it. Her locker was ajar, though she clearly remembered locking it before her shift. Valerie froze, her heart hammering in her chest as she pulled it open the rest of the way. Sitting on top of her things was an envelope, plain, white, unmarked. With trembling hands she picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, the words typed in bold, black letters. She is not who you think she is. Leave her before it's too late. And tucked alongside it was a photograph. Valerie's stomach dropped. It was a picture of Elena, her Elena, Smiling brightly at a formal event, her arm looped through that of a man Valerie didn't recognize. He was tall, handsome, with sharp features and an expensive suit. They looked happy, comfortable together. Valerie's breath caught, her thoughts spiraling as she stared at the picture. Who is he? And why did this feel like a threat? That night, Valerie confronted Elena as soon as she walked through the door. Elena, Valerie said sharply, holding up the photograph. Who is this? Elena's face went pale, her smile vanishing instantly. Where did you get that? She asked, her voice tight. It was in my locker at work, Valerie replied, her voice trembling. With a letter telling me to leave you. Who is he, Elena? Elena grabbed the photo, crumpling it in her hand as her composure cracked. Where did you get this? She repeated louder this time. I just told you. Valerie shot back, stunned by the anger in Elena's voice. What's going on? Who is he? Elena exhaled shakily, sinking onto the couch as though her legs could no longer hold her weight. His name is Matthew Carter, she whispered, her voice broken. He's my ex-husband. Valerie's eyes widened. You're what? I was married, Val, Elena admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. It was years ago. He was controlling, manipulative, abusive. I left him, but he never really let me go. Why didn't you tell me? Valerie demanded, her voice softer now, filled with hurt. Because I thought he was gone, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could bury that part of my life. But I was wrong. Valerie stared at her, her heart aching. She wanted to comfort Elena, to pull her close and tell her everything would be okay. But a dark truth hung between them now, and Valerie couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was happening was far from over. The days bled together, the once peaceful rhythm of Valerie and Elena's lives replaced by an unrelenting tension. What had started as ominous messages now manifested into a creeping invasion, each incident more unsettling than the last. First it was subtle. Valerie would notice small things. An open drawer she was certain she had closed, a framed photo of her and Elena knocked over on the coffee table. She tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to exhaustion or her own paranoia. But the truth gnawed at her, a splinter in her mind she couldn't remove. Then came the incident with her car. It was a chilly morning, the first rays of sunlight barely cutting through Chicago's winter gloom. Valerie had wrapped herself in a thick coat, her breath misting in the cold air as she approached her car in the hospital parking lot. She stopped mid-step, the air catching in her throat as her eyes landed on the windshield. Scrawled in jagged, hasty letters across the foggy glass was one word. Give up. Valerie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The letters were smeared, as though whoever had written them had used their fingers, leaving faint, greasy trails where their hands had pressed against the glass. The message glared back at her like a living thing, sharp and accusing. She spun around instinctively, scanning the parking lot for anyone lurking nearby. The streetlights flickered faintly, the lot mostly empty save for a few cars. Her breaths came in sharp, uneven bursts as she forced herself to move, fumbling for her phone with trembling hands. Call Elena, her mind screamed. Call someone. But she stopped herself, gripping her phone tightly. Whoever had done this wanted her afraid. They wanted to disrupt her. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Not here. Not now. When Valerie returned home that night, she found Elena hunched over her laptop at the dining table, the screen's cold blue glow reflecting off her face. A half-empty glass of wine sat beside her, untouched. Elena's usually confident posture was tense, her shoulders drawn up as if she were bracing for a blow. Valerie set her bag down softly, her voice hesitant. Elena? Elena flinched at the sound, closing the laptop quickly and glancing up with a strained smile. Hey, you're home. What were you looking at? Valerie asked, her brow furrowing as she approached the table. Elena hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the laptop. Just work emails. Nothing important. Valerie let the silence hang, her eyes searching Elena's face. Finally, she said softly, there was something written on my car today. Elena's face fell. What? Give up. Valerie's voice shook slightly despite herself. Someone wrote it on my windshield. Elena stood abruptly, pacing the length of the small living room. Her movements were restless, anxious, so unlike the composed, fearless woman Valerie had fallen in love with. I can't believe this, she muttered under her breath, her voice tight with frustration. I should have known he wouldn't stop. Matthew, Valerie said quietly, already knowing the answer. Elena paused, exhaling sharply as she turned to face Valerie. Her hazel eyes, usually filled with fire, now looked dulled by exhaustion. Yes. It's him. Why, Elena? Valerie pressed, the strain in her voice matching the knots in her chest. Why is he doing this? Why is he so obsessed with you? Elena sank onto the couch, pressing the heels of her hands against her forehead. When she spoke, her voice was low, heavy with regret. When I left Matthew, it wasn't just because he was controlling or abusive, she began, her words slow and deliberate. It was because I found out what he was doing. Embezzling money, laundering funds through his businesses. He thought he was untouchable, but I gathered enough evidence to expose him. I took everything to the authorities. Valerie blinked, stunned. You turned him in? I did. Elena lifted her gaze to meet Valerie's. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But Matthew, he didn't see it that way. He blamed me for everything that happened. His ruined career, the criminal charges, the embarrassment. He's never forgiven me. And I guess I was naive to think he would. Valerie's heart ached at the vulnerability in Elena's voice, at the weight she had been carrying for so long. But that weight wasn't just Elena's anymore. It had fallen onto them both, spreading like poison through the life they had built together. He's dangerous, Valerie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Elena replied, tears shimmering in her eyes. I didn't want you to get dragged into this. I thought, if I left it alone it would fade. Valerie moved to sit beside her, taking Elena's trembling hand in her own. We can't pretend anymore, Elena. He's not going to stop. Elena squeezed her hand tightly, her voice breaking. Then what do we do, Val? What do we do? Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The tension in their apartment was suffocating, the quiet punctuated by creaking floorboards, distant car engines, and the occasional soft knock that sent both women's hearts racing. Valerie found herself jumping at shadows, double-checking locks, and watching every dark corner of the hospital parking lot. Sleep was a luxury she no longer enjoyed. Every sound jolted her awake, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. And then came the night that shattered everything. It was supposed to be a reprieve. Elena had insisted on taking Valerie out for dinner. Something normal, something that would remind them of the life they were still fighting for. They laughed softly over shared plates of pasta, Valerie stealing glances at Elena's smile, trying to convince herself that things could still be okay. But when they returned home, everything changed. Valerie noticed it immediately. The faint crack in the doorframe, the splintered wood where the lock had been forced open. She grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her back as her heart slammed against her ribs. Elena, she whispered, her voice tight. Wait. The apartment was dark as they stepped inside, the air heavy and unnatural. Valerie flicked on the lights and both women froze. The living room was unrecognizable. Furniture was overturned, cushions torn apart like paper. Picture frames lay shattered on the floor, shards of glass glinting under the yellow light. Drawers had been yanked from the side tables and dumped onto the carpet, their contents strewn across the room like discarded memories. And then they saw the wall. Painted in thick, dripping strokes of red was a message. She is mine. Leave. Elena made a strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Her knees buckled and Valerie caught her before she collapsed, pulling her close as Elena sobbed into her shoulder. It's him, Elena choked out. It's Matthew. I know it's him. Valerie held her tightly, her own fear rising like bile in her throat. She looked around the destroyed apartment, the red letters seared into her mind, and something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but it was joined by something stronger, resolve. She pulled back, cupping Elena's face in her hands. Listen to me, she said, her voice steady and fierce. If you think I'm going to let him do this to us, to you, you're wrong. We are not running, Elena. We're not hiding. We're going to fight. Elena looked at her, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mix of despair and hope. Val. I mean it, Valerie said, her jaw tight. I love you. And I will not let him destroy what we have. Elena clung to her, burying her face against Valerie's shoulder as they stood surrounded by the wreckage of their home. Valerie stared at the red message on the wall, her hands curled into fists. Whoever Matthew Carter thought he was, Whatever power he believed he had, it was time to prove him wrong. She wasn't leaving. And neither was Elena. The sun had set hours ago, leaving Chicago cloaked in a thin, restless fog. The dim orange glow of streetlights cut through the mist, but their light did little to soften the oppressive air. Valerie's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding in sync with the rhythmic thud of her tires against the road. Next to her, Elena sat quietly, her face pale but determined, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "We're almost there," Valerie said, breaking the silence. Elena nodded, though her gaze remained fixed out the window. Their apartment was no longer a safe haven. It hadn't been for weeks. The walls that once held their laughter, their quiet moments of intimacy, had been tainted. The red words painted across the living room haunted them. Valerie could still see the dripping letters whenever she closed her eyes. But tonight wasn't about running. Tonight was about fighting back. With the help of a private investigator, a gruff, seasoned man named Larkin who didn't smile much, they'd begun to gather the evidence they needed against Matthew Carter. It wasn't easy. He was careful, cunning, and worst of all, relentless. The messages, the break-in, the threats, they weren't just attempts to scare Elena. They were calculated moves to destroy her life, her sanity, and her relationship with Valerie. But Valerie refused to let that happen. It wasn't long before the confrontation they feared most came crashing into reality. The evening started quietly enough. Valerie had just finished her shift and was supposed to meet Elena at her office downtown so they could discuss their next steps with Larkin. But when Valerie arrived, the building was eerily dark. The lights of the nearby parking lot barely illuminated the empty rows of cars. Something felt off. Valerie's stomach dropped as she spotted Elena near the far edge of the lot. She was backed against her car, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. And standing in front of her, his form towering and menacing in the shadows, was Matthew. Valerie's breath caught in her chest, adrenaline surging like lightning through her veins. She flung open her car door and stormed across the pavement, her voice cutting through the silence. "Elena!" Both figures turned. Matthew's face twisted with rage as Valerie approached. His dark hair was slicked back and his expensive coat hung perfectly on his frame, but there was nothing polished about his demeanor. His eyes were wild, his mouth curled into a sneer. "This doesn't concern you," Matthew growled, his voice low and dangerous. Valerie stopped just feet away from them, planting herself firmly between Matthew and Elena. She could feel Elena's presence behind her, the trembling energy of someone on the brink of breaking. But Valerie wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm making it my concern," Valerie said coldly, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. She stared Matthew down, refusing to back away. "You don't have power over her anymore." Matthew took a step closer, his expression contorting further. "She belongs to me," he hissed, his words venomous. "You don't know what she's done, what kind of woman she is. She doesn't belong to anyone," Valerie shot back, her anger breaking through her calm exterior. "And you don't get to rewrite the story. She left you. She chose to be free." For a moment, the air between them felt like a live wire, crackling with danger. Matthew's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained rage. Valerie tensed, ready to react if he moved toward Elena. "Get in the car," Matthew barked suddenly, his voice snapping like a whip as he glared at Elena. "No," Elena said, her voice shaking but defiant. She stepped closer to Valerie, her hand brushing against Valerie's back as if drawing strength from her presence. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Matthew lunged. It happened in an instant, a blur of movement as he reached for Elena's arm. But Valerie was faster. She stepped into his path, shoving him back with enough force to make him stumble. "Get away from her!" Valerie shouted, her voice echoing through the empty lot. Matthew stared at her, his face red with fury. For a split second, it looked like he might charge at her again, but distant sirens broke through the tension. Elena had called the police earlier, Valerie realized, and now the faint sound of salvation was growing closer. "You'll regret this," Matthew spat, his voice trembling with rage as he turned and stalked away, disappearing into the night. Valerie didn't move until she was certain he was gone, her hands still clenched into fists at her sides. She turned back to Elena, who was leaning against the car, breathing heavily, her face wet with tears. Valerie stepped closer, cupping Elena's face in her hands. "Hey, you're okay." "He's gone." Elena's lip quivered as she looked at Valerie, her voice breaking. I thought he was going to take me. Never, Valerie said firmly, pulling her into a tight embrace. I won't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The confrontation was enough for the police to take action. The investigator had gathered enough evidence to connect Matthew to the threats, the break-in, and now the direct confrontation. A restraining order was issued, and within days, Matthew was arrested for violating it. But his arrest didn't immediately erase the damage he had caused. In the following weeks, Elena faced a new storm, one Matthew had set into motion before his arrest. False rumors spread through legal circles, whispers about her ethics, her past, and her personal life. Valerie watched as Elena's confidence wavered, as her reputation took hits she couldn't defend against without reopening old wounds. One night as they sat together on the couch, Elena broke down. I'm afraid you'll leave me, she confessed, her voice raw. I'm a mess, Val. My life is chaos and you don't deserve that. Valerie turned to her, pulling Elena's hands into her own. You listen to me, she said softly, her voice steady. I don't want perfect, Elena. I want you. Messy, chaotic. You. I love you and I'm not going anywhere. Tears streamed down Elena's face as she buried her head in Valerie's shoulder, letting the words wash over her like a bomb. Months later, with Matthew's case pending trial, Valerie and Elena made a decision. Chicago had become a battleground, a place haunted by shadows of fear and broken glass. They didn't see leaving as a surrender but as a chance to reclaim their lives. They found a small house in Portland, a quiet green corner of the world where they could breathe again. As they unpacked their belongings, Valerie watched Elena smile for the first time in weeks. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, catching in Elena's hair, and for a moment, everything felt right again. We're going to be okay here, Elena said softly, turning to Valerie. Valerie walked over, wrapping her arms around Elena's waist. Yeah, she agreed. We are. That evening, as Valerie unpacked a box of books, she noticed a small, unmarked envelope tucked beneath one of the flaps. Her brow furrowed as she picked it up, her fingers brushing over the smooth paper. Elena, she called out, her voice tight. Elena appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. What is it? Valerie held up the envelope. Did you see this? Elena shook her head, her expression puzzled. No. What's inside? Valerie hesitated, then carefully tore the flap open. Inside was a single slip of paper with one sentence typed neatly across it. You can run, but you'll never be safe. The words sent a chill down Valerie's spine, and she looked up to meet Elena's wide, terrified gaze. Outside, the wind howled against the house, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, echoing like a gunshot. Valerie tightened her grip on the paper, her voice low and steady. We'll face this. Together. Elena nodded, but neither of them could ignore the truth. The fight wasn't over yet,